Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again this week. We're going to give it just a moment before we go ahead and get started. I hope you're all having a wonderful Wednesday. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to give it just another moment before we get started. All right. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again for our weekly Wednesday webinar series. Today's webinar is on parental perspectives on gene therapy for children with hemophilia, the Exigency Study. My name is Austin Murtha, and I'm the Manager of Strategic Communications here at the National Hemophilia Foundation. At any point during the webinar, if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you're live streaming from one of our social media platforms, you can go ahead and throw your questions in the comment section. We have NHF staff members monitoring these questions, which we will post to our speaker after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to the community beginning on Friday, October 7th. It's already October, my gosh. I am joined today by Dr. Khair. Thank you for taking the time to join us. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to get us started.
Thank you, Alison. So as you just said, I'm Khair. I'm the Director of Research at HemNet here in London, as you can probably hear from my accent, the United Kingdom. And I'm very grateful to you for asking me to talk to you about the results of this sub-study within the Exigency Study, which you might also have heard about already, which is about the perspectives of gene therapy for people with haemophilia in the UK. These are my conflicts. So as well as being the Director of Research at HemNet, I'm also a haemophilia nurse at Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital in London and also the past chair of the WFH Nurses Committee. So I've been around in the world of haemophilia for a very long time. When I started in haemophilia about 30 years ago, I was saying to parents of children with haemophilia, gene therapy will come. We will be able to give your child gene therapy at some point in the future. What I didn't then realise was that those little boys would now be very much grown-up men within the haemophilia community. So it's taken a long time to get to where we are, and we're not quite there yet. But the aim of this overall exigency programme was to examine the real-world experience and impact of gene therapy on a diverse community of people and their family members affected by haemophilia who either have had or would like to have gene therapy within the United Kingdom. So this is a British study. And the objective really was to explore their expectations that the people with haemophilia and their families had about gene therapy, how it might manage their care right now, and how it might manage their care in the future if they were to have it. So why the name Exigency or Exigency, however you'd like to pronounce it? It's a noun which means an urgent need or demand. And we chose this because at the time that we started this study, which was about 4 years ago, we were hearing that companies were about to submit for approval for gene therapy to become a clinically available treatment rather than a clinical trial option. So we thought the time was right to understand why people were choosing gene therapy, or if they couldn't have it, what the impact of not being able to have it was. And you can see that it's an urgent need, it's a want, a requirement, and a requisite. So this study overall has 6 sub-studies within it. So the whole thing is looking at the experience of gene therapy for haemophilia A and B within the UK. So either for people who have had gene therapy, people who were offered it and then had it withdrawn for some reason, so they screen failed to be in a clinical trial, people who have been offered it but didn't want it, people who want it but haven't yet been offered it, healthcare professionals' views, and the views of parents and children with haemophilia. Just want to be very clear at the moment is that gene therapy for children with haemophilia is not available in either a clinical trial or commercially. So this is a kind of slightly hypothetical view of what parents of children with haemophilia might think and might want, and we'll come back to that in a few more slides' time. So just to set the scene for you about the haemophilia in the UK, we have a national haemophilia database, which is called the UK Haemophilia Centre Doctors Organisation. So this is the UK HCDO at the bottom here of the screen. And we have to submit, a bit like you do to Athen in the States, we submit all of our patient data, how many patients are diagnosed, how many treated, what kind of treatment they have. And that goes annually to the National Haemophilia Database. And so you can see here, this is the United Kingdom, which comprises of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. We have a total of 8,700 people with haemophilia A, and 2,140 of those have severe haemophilia, and 2 of those are women. So the vast, vast, vast majority are men. And there are 370 people with severe haemophilia B out of a total of 1,946. So given that gene therapy is only available for people with severe haemophilia, we're looking at a population of about 2,500, mostly men with severe haemophilia. And currently in the UK, there are 31 people, or at the end of 2021, there were 31 people who had undergone gene therapy, 22 of those for haemophilia A and 9 for haemophilia B. So obviously during COVID, the recruitment into the gene therapy studies stopped. And now that we're out of COVID, they've started again. And so more people have now had gene therapy, but we don't have the up-to-date numbers yet. The red dots on this map of the UK show the main haemophilia treatment centres. And the yellow dots are haemophilia centres as well as gene therapy treating centres. And that cluster of yellow and red is in London, which is where I am right now. So if we think about children, there are 2,262 children and young people aged less than 18. That's the way that the UK HCDO collects the data on patients is by age group. And so anybody under 18 is lumped into the children's cohort. Now, I wouldn't say that a 17-year-old is necessarily a child. 717 of those have got severe haemophilia A and 123 have severe haemophilia B. So about 1,000 children, give or take a few, with severe haemophilia. Still not able to have gene therapy, so there's no yellow dots on this map for where children are treated. So why talk about gene therapy for children with haemophilia? I think we need to remember that children grow up. They're not always children, they become adults. And it's really important that we're understanding what parents understand right now about gene therapy in the haemophilia space, recognising that their children will be the ones who might have gene therapy in the future when it's commercially available, or indeed in new gene therapy clinical trials as they come online. And we're going to only today be talking about the views of the parents of children. So we did this is a sub-study, so it's one part of the 6 studies in the Exigency Study, and this has 2 parts to it. There's an online survey and then there's interviews. So once we had ethical IRB approval, we were able to advertise the online survey via the UK haemophilia social media platforms. And then we were able to ask people who did the survey if they wanted to take part in an online focus group. In that, we did purposive selection, so we chose people who were geographically disparate, who were mums and dads who had children with haemophilia A or B. So we've got a very broad range of parent participants. We recorded and transcribed the online focus groups verbatim, so we recorded exactly what it was that parents said. And then we analysed those comments using something called thematic analysis. So linking together all of the comments that parents might have said that were in part of a theme. So maybe something like, I don't want gene therapy for my child right now, and right now isn't the right time for my child to have gene therapy, would come under a theme of not right now, but maybe later. So if we looked at the online survey, we asked parents for some demographic data about them and their children. So whereabouts in the country they lived, so that we could get that very broad spread. This wasn't all parents who lived in London or who lived in big cities. Whether they went to a comprehensive care centre or a haemophilia treatment centre, whether they were the mum or the dad of the child with haemophilia, whether they had a past family history of haemophilia or whether their child was the first one in the family to be diagnosed, how many children they had altogether in their family, how many were affected boys, and how many were affected girls, be it that they were unaffected carriers, if they knew that, or whether they were in fact girls with haemophilia themselves. We wanted to know how old the children were, what type and severity of haemophilia they had, what treatment they had, whether they were on prophylaxis or on demand. UK treatment is that all children get prophylaxis from the first or second joint bleed. So all of the children in this study were on prophylaxis. We were happy to include children with inhibitors, either current or past. And so it didn't matter whether you had an inhibitor or not, you could still be in this study. We then asked the parents some questions about gene therapy, whether they'd heard of it or not, where they'd heard about it from, how they rated their understanding, whether they could rate their understanding of gene therapy in children, not just in gene therapy overall, whether they knew anybody personally with haemophilia who'd had gene therapy, so somebody perhaps in their family, whether their child was asking about gene therapy. So going back, as I said earlier, we used to say to parents, gene therapy will come for your child. So those children obviously heard that, and maybe they were asking questions about could they now have it. And that led into those knowledge of regulatory status of gene therapy. So whether they understood that this was still clinical trials in the UK and that it wasn't yet a clinical trial that children could even be in. We then asked the parents to write free text up to 5 words or phrases that came to mind for them when they talked about or thought about gene therapy, so that we could make a word cloud. And you can see here, which will come onto the word cloud in a minute, but you can see these as the results of the survey. So 158 surveys were started, and from that we only had 63 eligible participants. And so we screened out people who were not resident in the UK, who were not parents. So we had some other caregivers, some grandparents, some aunts and uncles. And we also screened out everybody who said they had no knowledge at all about gene therapy. So that left us with 63. And for all of those haemophilia mums out there that are listening right now, thank you, because you're always so reliable. So of the 63 participants, 60 of you were mums of children with haemophilia. About half had a previous family history, so somebody else in the family with haemophilia other than their firstborn child with haemophilia. Nearly everybody had heard about gene therapy, so 95% had heard of it. Only 28% they reported having a good understanding, so that's something that as healthcare professionals we should be not only saying gene therapy is coming, but actually explaining how gene therapy works, and we'll come back to that later. 88.3 or 84% would consider gene therapy as a treatment for their child, and 60-something% didn't realise that their child couldn't have gene therapy right now. So again, as healthcare professionals, we might be communicating about gene therapy, but we're not doing it in a way that means that parents recognise they can't have it for their child yet. So the word cloud put in, as you can see here, the larger the word is, the more it was reported. So things like, it would be life-changing, it offers hope, it offers a cure, but also it would be an unknown future, it would be risky and scary. And there were some concerns around losing identity. And we'll come back to that because that came out again in the interviews. Things around consent, things about the operation, which we'll come back to again later. And things about ethics and choosing when to have gene therapy for your child, if that was possible. So for all of the parents that completed the survey, they were also asked if they would like to participate in the interviews. So of the 63 people that we'd selected out, 42 said that they would be interested in participating. We invited 19 to start with, and the purpose for that was that we wanted to do small groups of focus groups, or small numbers in the focus groups, to see what kind of information we were getting and then expand the interviews if we needed to. So 19 were invited, 10 participated in 2 focus groups, which had 5 people in each. We lost the dads, even though we invited all 3 of the dads who had said that they wanted to participate, they didn't actually, so we ended up with all mums. Between them, they had 12 children, including affected girls. The ages were between 1 and 19, and the median age of the child that they had with haemophilia was 9. All of them had severe haemophilia. One had a child with haemophilia B. All were on prophylaxis. So as I said earlier, the UK treatment is that all children get prophylaxis from the first bleed. So all of these children were on prophylaxis with a factor 8 or a factor 9 concentrate, and that might have been either a standard half-life or an extended half-life product. 3 of them were being treated with emicizumab, and 1 of those was for a little boy who had a current inhibitor. From those 2 focus groups, we had 5 themes that emerged. They were awareness about gene therapy, an understanding of gene therapy, attitudes towards gene therapy, opinions about gene therapy for their child rather than what they knew about gene therapy globally, and how to communicate the information about gene therapy. And because we got such good information from those 10 participants that we invited of the 19, we didn't go back to any of the others to get any further participants. So for the next few slides, I'm just going to share with you the information that we got around these 5 themes. So the first theme was awareness about gene therapy. And you can see in the little table at the top that the source of their awareness in frequency of mentions, with the highest at the top, was that most of them heard about gene therapy from their haemophilia treatment centre or their medical team, which is really good because that hopefully means that they're getting good information that is factually correct. They also heard about it from the general media, and I think there's a lot about gene therapy, particularly in the UK at the moment, for children who have conditions that are not haemophilia, so other life-limiting conditions. And there was a lot of experience from that of parents wanting to know about the gene therapy that had happened for those other conditions. They also heard about Facebook, usually from haemophilia-specific sites, personal blogs, and their friends and families. And whilst the awareness was high, it was vague and fragmented, and we'll come back to this again later. Particularly this quote here from at the bottom, where one mum told us that having gene therapy was an operation, that you would be in hospital for about 2 weeks whilst we changed the cells, which sounds a little bit like a quick bone marrow transplant. So obviously there's some misinformation out there about what gene therapy is and what it would mean for children if they were able to have it. I said earlier that the parents were parents of children, young people who were aged 1 to 19, but mostly they'd heard about gene therapy in the last 1 to 2 years. So even though we've been talking about gene therapy as a potential treatment since I started nursing in haemophilia 30 years ago, these are families who'd come to it fairly recently. And even though they'd heard about it in the last 1 to 2 years and said that they got that information from their haemophilia treatment centre or the medical team, most said that they'd had no formal explanation. And mostly they thought that it was because it was only available for adults and that would be in the future. And that at some point in the future, somebody would talk to them about it potentially for their child. These are things that people said as really nice quotes about their understanding about what gene therapy is or isn't. So those at the top are things that are almost right. So changing the proteins to get the body to start producing clotting factor, an infusion into the liver cells to replace the clotting factor, getting a gene with normal factor in a non-active virus that then reproduces the factor, injected into a vein through a drip like an antibody that goes to the liver and produces clotting factor, and piggybacking a bacteria to trigger factor production. So almost right. But some had descriptions of gene therapy that were definitely not quite right. So something that suppresses the immune system, that's not what we do. But perhaps what they'd heard was that in people who'd had gene therapy, if they got a transaminitis, so if their livers became inflamed after they'd had the gene therapy, they may well have had immune suppression as steroids to dampen down that reaction to maintain the gene therapy. This lady saying it's a course of treatment to change the body, a period of time in hospital to change the cells, a bit like a bone marrow transplant. It's something that is administered more than once because it isn't lifelong. So it isn't lifelong currently, but currently nobody has had it more than once. And that doesn't mean that it isn't going to be potentially possible in the future, but that's not something that we're talking about doing at the moment. You need to come off treatment to get the body back to natural levels of factor. So of course we wouldn't stop treating anybody, which would put them at risk of bleeding, to give them a treatment to stop them from bleeding. That it completely cures haemophilia. And this was really interesting in two ways. One, that some of the ladies thought that the level of expression of factor 8 or factor 9 after gene therapy would be so high that you would have a factor 8 or a factor 9 level that was in the normal range. And although that has happened for some people, it hasn't happened for all. And so we're not curing the haemophilia, we're perhaps converting somebody with severe haemophilia into somebody who has a mild or moderate haemophilia, but may still bleed and may still need treatment if they needed surgery. The other thing that haemophilia gene therapy does not do is cure the gene mutation. All that it does is to replace the factor. So people with haemophilia will still genetically have haemophilia, and they will still pass on haemophilia to their daughters. And so for one of the mums, this came as a bit of a surprise, and she was very disappointed that even if she could treat her child and make him not have haemophilia anymore, she would still not be able to stop her grandchildren from being carriers and for there to be more haemophilia in the family. And that it is far into the future and not anywhere near reality for anybody yet. And of course, we now know that that's not true, and that certainly here in the UK and in Europe, there are license applications have been accepted for gene therapy to become a commercially available treatment. We haven't quite got to being able to do that yet, but it is certainly on the horizon, and maybe within the next year or so, gene therapy will be a reality for adults, but still not yet for children. So what were the drivers and barriers towards having gene therapy? You can see that for parents, administering prophylaxis, if we say to you, please treat your child every other day, please do it at 8 o'clock in the morning before your child goes to school and before you go to work, that's actually really problematic. It's really difficult to do that, particularly if you've got more than one child. So you might have 3 or 4 children. The whole burden of doing that prophylaxis all the time is difficult for parents, and where I appreciate that more now than I probably ever did when I was in direct clinical care. That gene therapy offers the potential for fewer bleeds. So even if you're doing that treatment every other day, never failing, always doing it, your child still might get a bleed. That the target factor levels at the moment might not be achievable in your individual children. So despite being on the best treatments with the, an extended half-life and the correct dose, they still may have a trough level that is not high enough to protect them from bleeding. And there was one family that were from Africa, and they and their older child wanted to be able to travel to a country where treatment wasn't available. So if they ran into problems when they got back to the country that they originated from, they were not able to have such great haemophilia care. And they thought that having gene therapy would be really advantageous, and that they wouldn't then, if they went back to Africa, have bleeding that they needed to worry about. Of course, the barriers are huge. The responsibility of making a decision about having gene therapy for your child might change your child. And some of the parents talked about how having haemophilia creates the identity of the child. They are a child with haemophilia, and if you take that away, you might change them. The child might rebel in the future about the parent making that decision for them. Taking away that haemophilia, if it is a defining part of them in their life. So perhaps if you're in a family of 3 brothers and only one of them can have it, why only that one? And what does that mean for the relationship with the other brothers? And actually a real belief that the child should make this decision for themselves. And so you can't do that as a small child. So in the UK, the age of consent is 16. So you would be able to perhaps consent at 16 if this treatment were available. But you would obviously have a long lead in to thinking about whether this is the right thing for you to do or not. And there were a lot of safety concerns. So here in the UK at the moment, we are right in the middle of a legal case about the contaminated blood scandal from back in the 1980s. And so that is very high in the press and very high on people's radars. So there were a lot of concerns about whether this was something that was an unknown thing that we might be thinking about doing to children. the possible side effects. So would this be something that in 40 years' time we would say we wish we hadn't done that to our children? If you had to give steroids to support immune suppression, what would be the long-term safety of that? Disrupting that stable treatment with many of the children in the parents of the children in the study on prophylaxis having few or no bleeds, having such good prophylaxis that they didn't need to. And what if you had gene therapy and then you got an inhibitor, you'd never had one before? How would that be managed and what would happen in the future? So these are some of the quotes about their opinions for having gene therapy for their child or children. One lady said she thought it would have to be a pretty bad situation to want to try it now. It might be, if it was such an awful situation, it was an only option that they would think about it. Here's this thing about being guinea pigs of our generation and going back in 40 or looking back in 40 years' time and thinking, why did we think that was the right thing to do when we had many treatments available already that had many years worth of experience? One lady who was quite positive about the thought of gene therapy for her child, thinking that it would cure the gene, not just the factor level, and then finding out that it still gets passed on to the next generation. So that's a bit of a downer. And she would have been much more interested in gene therapy if we'd been able to stop the gene being passed on and causing a haemophilia in future generations. And this one that says we would absolutely not consider it until he was old enough to make the decision himself, because it's permanent, it would be changing him, and I'd want him to make that decision himself. There's some quite complicated thinking about something that's really very hypothetical still. We talked to them about how they would like us to communicate about gene therapy to them and their children. And they said that there was a need for simple, reliable, trusted, impartial information. And that had to be child specific because the children are the future recipients. They said we should start educating children at about the age of 10. And I really like this quote. It's like sex education. You start young, give them the facts, they learn as they grow older, and hopefully they'll make the right choices as they grow up. That means we as healthcare professionals have got to start producing information, leaflets or animations or booklets, or even just talking to youngsters about the treatments that are available for them in the future, and also the ones that are available now. Not just gene therapy though, because we know there are many other things coming. So we need to start thinking about how we do that now, so that we've got really health literate 18, 19, 20-year-olds that are making those choices for themselves as they grow. They wanted to hear personal stories from people who'd had gene therapy. So they said here, I'm following a person on Instagram. He's not being paid by anybody to do it. I can see this personal approach and how it's changed his life. And that's important to me, to have that sort of peer buddy support. And for all of the nurses that are listening, you'll be very pleased to know that they wanted that information to come from nurses, or to be supported by nurses, not just to come from us. And they said that we were the most trusted and best placed people to tailor age-appropriate age and advice and support for those young boys and their family members. So in conclusion, gene therapy for children with haemophilia is not the same as gene therapy for children with other life-threatening conditions such as immune deficiency and muscular dystrophy, which we might see in the press about how this is revolutionising the lifespans of these children and the quality of life of these children. I say that with a huge caveat. So, for all of those of you that are listening, I'm sitting here in the middle of London. Many of you I know are in the States, and you're able to access care and factor and treatment relatively easily. If you're in the middle of Africa and you have a child with haemophilia, you can't access that care. And so it may well be that although we sit here in the West and say we're not going to do this for children, that children in developing world countries may access gene therapy perhaps before children do in the West. Globally, though, I think children are not likely to be having gene therapy in the near future. And part of that reason is that we know that the livers of children are continuing to develop until they're about 12. So if we gave them gene therapy before that, there's some concern that the vector that carries the factor and the gene into the liver, as the liver develops, might be lost. And so it might mean that the children then couldn't have gene therapy later on. But also there's this whole issue of this being an ethical concern about patient, the child that becomes the adult, and that the parents felt that they shouldn't be making that choice for their children at the moment when they're able to access really good care at the moment. Children don't stay children forever, although those of us who have adolescent teenagers and young adults might think sometimes they do. They all become adults at some point, and they're able then to make their own decisions. So we need to really be educating the children of today about the potential future treatments that there are for them, be that gene therapy or other products. And we need, as a community, to debate how we implement that. So the parents say they want that information from the healthcare teams at the haemophilia centres. It may well be that in the country that you live in, gene therapy will be given in a gene therapy centre rather than a haemophilia centre. We need to talk to the young people themselves, so the young boys who aren't eligible for gene therapy, about how they would want to hear about it. And that really means that we have to have really good shared decision making. And that's a very kind of buzzword in the world of haemophilia at the moment, talking to people about what kind of treatment they want and making the decisions that they need to make. And to do that, that really means we've got to have much better health literacy, with people being fully aware of all the treatments that are available now and in the future. So a couple of more slides. So just to say, as a major limitation for this is a really small study, 10 mums of children with severe haemophilia who are all well treated, all on prophylaxis, and all in the UK. So this may not be, if we repeated this study and we did it in America or we did it with 10 different people in the UK, we might get different results. So this is probably not representative of all caregivers with parents of children with haemophilia across the regions of the culture. So a little bit of caution, and maybe that'll come up in the questions in a minute or two. But we have so much more to do. So we have to prepare children for the reality as adults, and that means we have to work with their parents too about what it is going to be like for children as they grow up into the world of adult haemophilia. Those expectations around gene therapy, so everything that I've said so far has been about the gene therapy trials that have been running over the last 10 years or so. Gene therapy is changing. There are different vectors, there are different genes that are being used, which are perhaps going to make a longer survival of the factor in the blood. It might mean that you have a higher level. We don't yet know. So it may well be that gene therapy becomes a different treatment in 5 years' time from what we're giving now. We need to think about how we follow up all of these people, including things like the quality of life and the impact on daily living. How we do that, not quite sure yet. Perhaps filling in a questionnaire isn't the right way to do that. And if we've changed you from having severe to mild haemophilia and we only see you once every 1 or 2 years, probably filling in a quality of life questionnaire isn't the right way to do it. We need to think about how we engage with people who've had gene therapy, to think about what's the right things we should be asking to see whether this has really been worth it for them. We know that some people who have had gene therapy, it has worked for quite a long time, and then perhaps at 5-10 years after gene therapy, the amount of factor that is being expressed in their blood has fallen a little bit. So they know maybe now have to have some treatment when they didn't before, or they might have to go back onto prophylaxis. And we need to think about how we're going to manage that for those people when that happens. Really importantly, and I think, and this is coming out of the Exigency Study and the other bits, not the parents' bits, obviously, because parents haven't been with their children through gene therapy, but the impact on the wider family. So what happens when your brother no longer has haemophilia or your husband no longer has haemophilia? How do we assess that impact in the other family members? That's something we need to really be thinking about, particularly if you do have to have the steroids. So we know that some people become very hyperactive, maybe a little bit aggressive. Some get a little bit depressed on the steroids. And it is the wives, the parents, the siblings that are living through that as well. We need better education for the future generations, and we need to think about the children and the adults in the countries where they don't have access to treatment. So if you want to read more, this has been published and it is free to download on haemophilia, so please do go and have a look at it, or just contact me and I can send you a copy. So I would like to just finish off by saying a very big thank you to you all for inviting me to give this talk today. It's really lovely to be able to talk to you from my house here in London. I'm not quite sure where you all are, and I can't see any of you. I would also like to thank all of the participants who took part in not just the parents part of this study, but all of the sub-studies. To the other members of the research team, my name might be on this paper, but I'm certainly not the only person that did it. There was lots of people behind the scenes making this work. And the study was actually sponsored by Unicure, so I'd like to thank Unicure for sponsoring the study overall. And with that, I will stop talking and hopefully there's some questions to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions that they would like to throw in the Q&A, you're more than welcome to do so. I do have a few questions for you in the meantime, so let me go ahead and pull those up real quick. Okay, so what were the greatest challenges in your research?
So I think COVID was one of them. So that was a challenge in that originally the study was designed to have face-to-face interviews with individual people, either in their homes or in their haemophilia centres, obviously for the parents, wherever it was convenient for them. We had to change that so that we did everything on Zoom. And that took quite a long time to get back through the ethics because people were a bit worried about what might we see. But actually, in hindsight, I think it's a really lovely way to do research because the people that are being interviewed have chosen what time they want to have their interview, and they are very happy in their own home, their office, their wherever it is that they want to be. So we interviewed people who were cooking their dinner, who were sitting on the beds, the children were watching the telly, the dog was doing whatever. And so actually it gave you a real insight into their lives and how they live their lives. And I think that was different to had we gone to their house, they would have tidied up and they would have been very proper. So that was a challenge, but also a good outcome, I think.
Do you plan to continue your study in a post-COVID era where you could go and meet with the participants in person?
So this exigency study is now complete. We've done all of the interviews apart from the healthcare professionals, so there's one last bit for that to be done. We are doing another study, this time with patients or people with Glanzmann's thrombocythemia, which is a rare bleeding disorder, it's a platelet disorder. And they have a choice either to have a Zoom interview or a face-to-face at a place and time convenient to themselves. So far, they've all chosen Zoom, so maybe we've changed research.
That's very interesting. So let's see. Were there any conclusions from your study that you were relatively surprised by?
I think that, you know, so I knew some of these, the mums that were in this study, they were mothers of children that I'd looked after over the years. And having sort of said to them for the last 20 years, gene therapy is coming, for them then to have not a misunderstanding, but not the knowledge that I thought they might have was quite surprising. And that just shows that as healthcare professionals, we don't communicate with them properly. We're not telling them, this is what's happening in the world of haemophilia, this is what it means for you and your child, and this is what might happen in 5 years' time, or 10 years' time. So it's about us communicating better.
Do you have any advice for other people in the field to communicate with their patients better about gene therapy?
So I think yes and no. So obviously we all think we know our patients very well. And I think many patients will come into clinic and will say the things that they think we want to hear. So we say, do you get this? Is that okay? And they go, yeah, that's fine. And then they haven't really quite grasped what we've said, or we've said it 5 times and they still haven't got it and they don't want to ask again. So I think there's a whole piece of work that we should be doing around health literacy and making sure that people understand it, and particularly when things change. So if you're thinking about a child, we do all the education with the parents, and we kind of assume that the children get their information from their parents, and they may well do. But if we did the education of the parents 10 years ago, then the information the child is getting is 10 years out of date. So we need to keep on giving the information. And I think sometimes that feels a little bit like, oh, we're nagging them because we're telling them the same things again. It's about making sure that we're telling them, and in ways that are appropriate. So don't just assume that everybody reads everything that we give to them. Some people can't read and they won't tell you that. So it's about having different ways of sharing education and information.
Do you have any advice that you offer the parents on how to communicate with gene therapy about their children, about gene therapy with their children?
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about this, and it's a difficult scenario really, because they said they wanted that information at around about the age of 10. So if we start doing that at 10, actually gene therapy might not be around for them for another 10 years. We're still waiting, although we've got the EMA, so the European Medicines Agency, has approved gene therapy. It isn't yet available in the UK, so we don't want to say too much just in case for some reason it doesn't become available. But I then do think it is about not just gene therapy but all the treatments, and it's about making sure that the parents understand how factor works so that they can tell that to their children, because that's the very basics, and then from that you can do that sort of the pharmacokinetics. You put enough petrol into the car, you drive to Granny's, you've used up the petrol, you need to put some more in, through to different ways that the blood clots, through to gene therapy. So it's a whole process of explaining and understanding. Hopefully it's complicated. It used to be easy, it used to be factor or nothing, and now there's this whole choice of things.
Okay, so one question I have is it ethical for me as a parent to consent for my child to have gene therapy when there are other good treatments available?
It's a very good question. So luckily at the moment, gene therapy, as I said earlier, is still not available for children.
Right.
So we don't have to face that. I think it depends on where you are in the world. So if I was the mother of a child with haemophilia in Uganda, my response to that question would be very different to being the mother of a child in London. That's why I think gene therapy for haemophilia is very different for gene therapy to those other conditions that children have where there is no other treatment, and those conditions are life limiting. But at the moment, I don't think anybody would be advocating that a parent would be consenting for a child to have gene therapy with haemophilia aged 5 in London.
Absolutely. Okay, and I'm going to open the floor to any more questions because I'm at my last one. But what is the biggest takeaway you want the audience to walk away with from your discussion today?
I think that the gene therapy, will come. And it will come initially for adults, and then it will come for either for younger children, or the younger children that we've got now will have grown up to become the adults of the future who will be able to do therapy. And we need to think carefully about how we educate them and their parents to make those quite difficult decisions, different from being in a clinical trial.
Sure, that's great.
Alison, it's Len.
Hi, Len. How are you?
Good.
Hi, Len.
Kate, thank you for a really enlightening presentation and some really, nice data. So my question is, what advice do you have or insights can you share from your study that can inform the work that organizations like NHF or EHC or WFH has to do in terms of developing these educational materials to have available and ready for children as gene therapy becomes closer and closer to an opportunity for them?
So that's a really good question, because I've never yet seen anything from anybody about gene therapy for children. And I think that's appropriate because it's not here yet. But I think we need to start thinking about, what is out there already that is in gene therapy for children with other conditions that we could adapt to haemophilia. Not saying, okay, so now you can have it age 14, but here is information for you age 14 about something you might be able to have in the future. And I think we should be, I don't think that should be individual pharma company specific. I think it should be, like you've just said, a WFH, EHC, NHS, production.
And maybe talk a little bit about channels that you think are going to resonate with the youngsters. Is this more through social media? Is it more, I think we're moving away from sort of the print material. How do we influence gaming and other ways to really be innovative in our education?
Yeah, another really good question. So if you think about, first off, I don't think any 14-year-old would read a booklet that you gave them, no hope. They also don't do the kind of social media that we do. So they don't do Twitter and Facebook. They're into different social media platforms, Pinterest and things that I don't understand. So we need really to have some young people who are haemophilia advocates to help us to get that information out to them. And I also think there's something about, I'm going to say peer-to-peer support and education, although of course you can't do that between two 14-year-olds, but at the moment, if you're 14 and the only person that that's had gene therapy is 56, that's not great. What you need is somebody that's closer in age. So if there is an 18, 20-year-old that's had it, then they could perhaps be some kind of buddy or mentor or a person who can share information, support for the younger people.
Yeah, thank you.
And I don't think it has to be A or B. I think it doesn't matter whether you've got haemophilia A or haemophilia B. That kind of conversation is similar.
Yeah. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank you once again, Dr. Khair, for taking the time to join us this afternoon. We appreciate your time and your expertise. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
And I'd also like to thank each one of our viewers for joining us. Please note that this recorded webinar will be available on Friday, October 7th at haemophilia.org under the events tab with all of our archived webinars. Also available in the events tab is our upcoming schedule for our weekly Wednesday webinar series. Thank you for joining us this afternoon and have a wonderful week.
Thanks all. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.